I'm Richard Reeves. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, but I'm also president of a brand new organization, which is the American Institute for Boys and Men, a think tank and research organization that will be specifically focused on the issues facing boys and men today.
So, Richard, you mentioned that both the left and the right are approaching masculinity incorrectly. Why do you think this gap exists where only the extreme definitions of masculinity is currently being presented?
It's one symptom of a broader problem in society, which is a polarization and zero sum, where the extreme views dominate. They dominate social media, they dominate the airwaves. And essentially what's happening in this very important debate about masculinity is that the right are saying you should be more like your dad, and the left is saying you should be more like your sister. And so there's this sense of like bring back old style masculinity on the right, which is like we need men to be real men again. And then on the left, there's a skepticism about the very idea of masculinity. And basically the message is, yeah, if you could just be less masculine and more feminine, that would be great. And in the middle are most of us, guys trying to figure this out and trying to figure out how to be guys in a world that's changed. It's a very different world in many ways for the good from the one that our fathers are in. So I think most of us sort of muddling our way through the middle, and then the loudest voices are the ones just giving us these extreme views that don't really echo, and actually they don't make sense to most men. I don't think of any generation, but especially young men.
And I actually personally think that's exactly the reason why you've been so popular, and I think why your book was such a big success. So in that instance, then, how would you personally define like a real and mature man?
Well, I love the fact you just said mature. Because I really like this idea of mature masculinity rather than non-toxic or even real and non-real and so on. Because the truth is that we all have to mature, right? Boys become men, girls become women. But the process by which a boy becomes a man is always a bit more fragile, a bit more socially difficult. There's a reason why every society has had rites of passage and ways to help boys make that transition to being mature men. So I like the way you framed it. And I like to think about this in terms of my own experience, both as a man and as a father. I have 3 sons, all of whom are in their 20s. And I've tried to raise them to have the courage to ask a girl out, the grace to accept no for an answer, and the responsibility that either way, they make sure she gets home safely. And to me, that captures a series of really important ingredients of mature masculinity, which is a sense of, being willing to put yourself out there, right? To take some risks and sometimes risk rejection or failure. I think that risk-taking aspect of masculinity can, of course, be a bad thing, but it can also be a great thing. The second is this sense of graciousness and understanding and absolute respect for women and other men and everyone else in society, and not least to have absolute respect for women as equals. But then thirdly, I think it does bring in the reality of something of a protector role, which is the reality that women on average are more physically vulnerable than men, and therefore it's entirely appropriate for men to act in a protective capacity when called on, which is hopefully not very often. So there I think we've got some pretty enduring elements of mature masculinity, and it's certainly the way I try to behave and the way I've tried to teach my own sons to behave.
That's so interesting, because everything that you just brought up isn't controversial. But you mentioned in an interview with Bill Maher that a lot of the people around you told you that you shouldn't write this book on masculinity. Have you received criticism since the book has been released, and why has masculinity become demonized?
Sure, I have had some criticism, but that's inevitable, and I welcome it. And I welcome constructive criticism for sure. There's one or two things which, as a result of the criticisms, I've changed my mind about, or realize I didn't quite get right. And so, it's not like you write a book and then you've like, that's it, right? It's in the book now, so I can't change my mind about it. Everything must be right. So I welcome that. And then there's a little bit of mudslinging stuff, which I get in roughly equal measure from partisans on the left and right. And the only thing I pay attention to is it roughly equal, right? If it suddenly tilted more one way or the other, I'd get more worried about it. But by and large, I've been pretty pleased by the fact that people want to talk about this as long as it's in the right way. The reason why people warned me against writing about it is actually where you started this conversation, which is because the whole debate about gender and masculinity in particular is so polarized, that the fear that people had on my behalf was that merely by raising the issues of boys and men, you put yourself in a particular tribe. And that's the tribe of people on the alt-right, in the manosphere, who are the ones who are talking most loudly about boys and men, and therefore against the other tribe, which is the tribe who are worried about women and girls. So if you do frame it as a zero-sum game, then sure, writing a whole book about boys and men puts you in that camp over there, and therefore opposed to that camp over there, and we're at war. There's a war on men or a war on women or both or whatever, but one thing we're sure about, there's a war. And if there's a war, you've got to pick sides. And I think every aspect of that is wrong. It's not zero sum. There isn't a war either way. There are all kinds of challenges facing young men and young women that are different as well as overlapping, and that most people are perfectly capable of holding two thoughts in their mind at once. And by and large, I've been pleased by the fact that that's the conversation most people want to have.
So I guess kind of like along that route of role models, you refer to Jordan Peterson as the thinking man's Andrew Tate, and that consuming this sort of content is sort of like a rite of passage for young men in modern times. What do you think has caused this rise in digital father figures, as you put it?
The search for an answer to the question of how should I be in the world today? What does it mean to be a man today? I don't think it's a coincidence that many of the most ardent or loyal followers of many of the figures you just mentioned are young men who perhaps didn't have a strong father figure in their lives. That's not true for all of them, but it does seem as if that's particularly true. And so there is a dad-shaped hole in the lives of many of those men. And then it's not surprising that they might look online or elsewhere, particularly if they can't find them in their real lives. Maybe, it's one of the reasons that I'm a bit obsessed with the lack of male teachers in schools, for example, or the lack of men coaching, right? Especially young men coaching, because what that means is that there's this multi-dimensional lack. It's not just maybe a lack of a father figure in the home, but the lack of other figures, male figures, more generally. That means you're looking, you're searching. Who do you find? Well, Jordan Peterson does act as a very empathetic and understanding ear for a lot of young men. He absolutely looks them in the eye and says, I understand you're struggling, and I understand there are issues in society. I disagree with him about a lot. I disagree with him about his solutions, etc. And then you get a figure like Andrew Tate, who does come along and make Jordan Peterson look like everyone's favorite cuddly, eccentric uncle, right? Suddenly you're like, oh, whoa, okay, this is a whole different thing. But I do think there's this general similarity, which is that if there are boys and young men who do feel lost and uncertain or just dislocated, disoriented, trying to figure out what it means to be a good man today. And by the way, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to be confused about right now. You're going to search for answers. And what those sorts of figures have in their favor is very straightforward, simple answers. And that's, of course, very attractive. I tend to think the answers are going to be more complicated and more nuanced, but I do understand the search. Even if I don't necessarily like where the search ends, I think it's very important not to denigrate the search. And that's why I said, you've obviously done your homework for this, that I think particularly for boys in liberal households, I can't tell you the number of liberal parents, liberal mums especially, that have said to me, my boy's starting to watch Andrew Tate or Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson or whatever. What should I do? And it's in these panicked tones. And I always ask, well, have they been raised in a very progressive and liberal environment? And if the answer is usually yes. And I say, well, in that case, just wait. In some ways, I almost would be more worried if they didn't go through a phase through which they wanted to explore the alternatives to the worldview that's being propagated around them. And they'll probably go through it, right? One thing we can be sure of is the average 16-year-old boy likes to be countercultural. I know I was. I know my boys were. And and so if you're raised in a pretty feminist and progressive household, the most countercultural thing you can do that's guaranteed to get a rise out of the people around you is start watching alt-right manosphere, guys.
Yeah, it's interesting too. And maybe it's like the consequence of today's modern times is that we kind of want that magic pill or like that quick fix, right? Rather than maybe the solutions, maybe the truth in the answer is that it takes a lot more time. It takes a lot more nuance. Then, I guess people don't really have time for that with all the information that's out there. But you also mentioned too that this is also a direct consequence of responsible figures refusing to speak on the challenges of boys and men. Why have responsible figures not been talking about the challenges?
The people in charge of the major institutions, that includes media, government, think tanks, my world, etc. I think the fairest interpretation is that some of them just haven't understood how deep some of these problems have become. But the reason they haven't understood that is because there aren't very many people writing and talking about it. So that's the very definition of a vicious circle. But the less generous interpretation is because they're afraid. And they believe, wrongly in my view, that it is zero-sum, and that if they suddenly start paying more attention to these issues of boys and men, highlighting them, that it means distracting from the issues facing women and girls. And most fatally, what I've been told by a number of people is, if we highlight, let's say, the fact that the male suicide rate is rising and 4 times higher than the female suicide rate, or we highlight the fact that men are further behind women in college today than women were in the 70s when we passed Title IX, or we highlight the fact that male wages have declined, all of that will fuel the alt-right figures who are saying boys and men are struggling. We're actually supporting their claims by doing it. And my view is that's absolutely wrong way to think about this, because these are facts. They're not opinions. And unless responsible people are engaging with those facts and sharing those facts and showing that they're taking those facts seriously, that creates an opening for, I would say, less responsible figures to weaponize them. And so when I had this argument with an I would describe him as an alt-right figure. He part of the manosphere. He might argue with the description, but he was saying, well, they don't care about male suicide. And I said, who's they? And he said, the government, the CDC. And I said, that's not true. He sent me a link to the CDC website on suicide disparities, which manages not to mention the gender gap in suicide. And at this point, I'm having this argument with this guy, and I'm thinking, you know what? He doesn't sound crazy when I look at the CDC website and find no mention of the biggest gap of all, which is between men and women. So what's happening, I think, is that now the CDC people, whoever makes that decision, might say, well, look, if we make a big thing of male suicide, it makes it seem like, all those guys out there, Jordan Peterson or whoever, they're right to be worried about boys and men. And I'm saying they are right to be worried about boys and men, and somehow publishing the data and hoping that no one notices is a really bad strategy. Far better to just embrace it and get into it and make these issues more mainstream rather than try and pretend they're not real.
Yeah, I think several different points that you brought up. It's like now we're living in a time where even talking to someone you disagree with means that you're platforming them and supporting them instead of you're probably trying to reach a mutual understanding. So going further along, you've talked in length about the fatherlessness crisis. So talking in the lens of dating, how has fatherlessness impacted both men and women when it comes to modern dating struggles and even preferences?
Wow, that's a really good question. I haven't really thought about it in the way that you've just framed it, but it's certainly clear that there's a fatherlessness problem. I mean, this has been something that, to be fair, a lot of conservatives have been warning about for a long time, and which Barack Obama briefly worried about just before he became president in a famous speech he gave on Father's Day in 2008. A brilliant speech, actually. I encourage everyone to go and read it, where he talked about the fact that missing from their children's homes, too many fathers are missing from their children's lives, and they are role models and coaches and teachers to their children. And so it's a real thing. It's a real problem. And one of the facts that I stumbled across that led me, in a way, to write the book was the fact that within 6 years of their parents separating, 1/3 of American children don't see their father again. That is a social and moral failure of extraordinary consequence and significance, because dads do matter for their kids' lives. Now, how does that play out in the dating market? I'm not sure here. So I'll just say a couple of things because I don't want to get ahead of my understanding of the evidence. But we know, for example, that girls who have good relationships with their dads when they're 16 have better mental health in their 20s and early 30s. That makes perfect sense. We also know that boys have good relationships with their. You don't have to think about it. It's like, okay, yeah, fine, and that's probably partly she's got better sense of self-efficacy, understands how to be around a guy, but also I think that kind of boys, children, actually maybe everyone this is true of, but certainly true of younger people and children. They believe their eyes, not their ears, and no curriculum, no words can replace just watching how your dad behaves as a man, watching how other men behave. And that direct form of learning is crucial. It is clear that young men have to some extent been de-skilled in terms of relationships. So I would say we have seen, I think I can say this with reasonable degree of confidence, is that we have seen a de-skilling in terms of relational skill among young men. Now, why is that? Some people would blame video games. Say, well, they're too busy playing video games to learn how to interact. Some people would blame family structure and say, well, they don't have a dad around, then they can't see how to behave. There's any number of potential explanations, but I think the fact is true. And what I really worry about is the vicious circle effect. I really worry that if young men become more risk averse around relationships, and especially around romantic relationships, they lose skills, right? It takes quite a lot of skill to figure out how to navigate that romantic space. I'd love to hear your views on this, because obviously there's a significant generational gap between us. But certainly when I was growing up, learning to deal with rejection, learning how to figure it out, learning how to talk, how to behave was central to any chance of romantic success. And given that young men are driven very strongly by a desire for sex and romantic success, there's a pretty steep learning curve. Right, you learn pretty quickly, but I do worry a little bit that you only learn by doing, and you only learn by failing to some extent. And I worry now that young men might be so worried of failing and being seen as creepy or something that they don't even subject themselves to the learning. But does that sound right to you?
I think that makes sense. I mean, obviously with the whole thing with dating apps and social media makes it so you don't really have to face that fear of rejection. You can still kind of hide behind the screen, but it's also in a way like open up a lot of possibilities too. So for example, I met my girlfriend who lives in Brazil through these YouTube videos, right? So that is also kind of a crazy thing that may not have been even possible in your generation, right? So I think as in everything, there's a lot of good and bad, but I think social media and the internet, in my opinion, is a tool, and it's all about kind of how you use it. But along those lines, you were also mentioning previously that, the explanation of, like, let's say porn, video games, and dating apps is kind of a lazy excuse to kind of put the blame on the individual when it comes to men's struggles in dating. But, a lot of people fail to mention things like the larger issues of economy, family lives, and the educational system. But I like to actually argue, isn't masculinity about personal responsibility? How in that instance, isn't it up to the man to kind of improve their dating struggles instead of just blaming it on these larger systems? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think that responsibility is the mark of adulthood, both for men and women. That responsibility might play out in different ways. And so it's super interesting to me, for example, that if you look at young adults who aren't in education and aren't in employment, so they're out. They're described as opportunity youth, or whatever phrase you want to use. But they're not in an institution. Like, most of the women are caring for a child. Most of the men are not. So there is something there even about responsibility that comes with being a parent, and particularly like if you're a hands-on full-time mum, that's a responsibility. So I wouldn't say that responsibility is just something that men have to do as opposed to women. But I would say you're right that there's more of a tendency perhaps to blame, I would say individually, and blame men. And so there's a sense of, well, if they could just pull their socks up at school and pay more attention at school, they'd do better. And if they would just kind of, keep themselves in shape and work out, then they wouldn't be so unhealthy. And if they would just, go out and make something of themselves, then women would be interested in them. If they could devote themselves to, so it's basically like a pull yourself up by the bootstraps message. Of course, that's true. And that's where I think some of the language from some of the influencers we talked about earlier can be quite helpful. So the one chapter of Jordan Peterson's book that I really wanted my sons to pay attention to was the one where it said, make your own bed. Sadly, that appears to be one that they were able to skip or ignore. But those, stand up straight, get yourself together, keep yourself in shape, devote yourself to something greater than yourself. These are amazingly good pieces of advice. But they're not a substitute for looking at the education system and saying, is the education system serving boys very well right now? And my answer is that for a lot of them, no, it's not. Has the labor market become a tougher place? When most American men earn less today than most American men did in 1979, is that their fault? Well, it's a pretty big stretch of the individual responsibility argument to say that those massive labor market changes have been the fault of men. And last but not least, look, in a world where 40% of breadwinners are women, 40% of women earn more than the average man now. This is a whole new world in terms of what does it mean to succeed as a man, right? You can't presume that someone's going to be dependent on you. So, as always, this is like a boring answer, but yeah, individual responsibility, but not just that. And men, I think, are reasonably unique, certainly on the center left, as being about the only group who are told, yeah, it's your fault. So that individualism you referred to typically is not applied to certain racial or ethnic groups or classes, etc. And so it does seem like there's a bit of hypocrisy there in the willingness of those, particularly on the center left, to attribute the travails of all other groups to structural causes. But when it comes to boys and men, oh no, it must be their fault as individuals. That just doesn't stack up for me, either intellectually or empirically. You've got to go one way or the other. And to be fair to social conservatives, they will very often apply that individual responsibility narrative to everybody. That's okay, but you've got to choose. Either you're interested in structural problems and imbalance, or you're not. And there is this weird asymmetry in the way that the center-left talks about this, which is structural everything, except when it comes to boys and men. And that's just wrong.
So you mentioned in a podcast with We Are Man Enough that we have expanded the range of ways to be a woman, but on the other hand, constricted it for men. Why have women been more successful in incorporating, let's say, more traditionally masculine traits or roles, while men have kind of struggled to incorporate more traditionally, let's say, feminine roles or traits?
Well, I think the bigger part of the answer is that it was mostly upside for women, because that what it was giving them was access to more economic power, more occupational status, etc. So a world where suddenly I could be a doctor and not just a nurse. I don't mean just in the sense of denigrating nursing, but suddenly, like, is that a better world for women? I mean, most women my mum was basically told by her parents, nurse or teacher. That was it, right? And so suddenly you're in a world where, hang on, a lawyer, president, doctor, CEO, management consultant, great. Those have come with more money and more occupational status. So it's not to say it's all been easy. For sure, those work-life balance issues and the tensions that a lot of women face. But it's that expansion has largely come with kind of more economic power and occupational status. The problem is that we're still in a society where a lot of those more feminine occupations or more feminine activities, and I was a stay-at-home dad for a few years, so I speak from some experience here, tend to get less status, tend to be less supported. And so weirdly, and I'm only just having this thought now in conversation with you, but weirdly, one of the consequences of the denigration of, quotes, women's work, for example, staying at home and raising children, has been to make it even less likely that men are going to want to do it. So weirdly, actually elevating the roles of parents and raising a home, being like, I loved running a home and raising my kids and so on too. But that was a countercultural thing to do. And generally, one result of modern society and arguably some aspects of feminism has been to sort of downgrade those activities. Well, then we wonder why men don't want to do them. And then by extension, like if we don't pay teachers very well and we don't pay social workers very well and we don't pay psychologists very well, that also makes it harder for men because they actually do still want to make a decent living, and men are a bit more sensitive to those economic equations than women are. That's just a fact. So if we want more men to do more women's work, then we'll have to elevate women's work.
That's actually a good point too, because men definitely give each other shit more vocally and maybe even physically than, let's say, women too. So I think the social pressure might also be more driving it. So last couple of questions. What benefits will there be to society when men are doing well?
Well, the downstream effects for women and children will be huge. But let me start by because this is one of the criticisms that I've had and I take seriously, which is that let's start with men themselves. There are a lot of men who are really struggling right now, struggling to figure out their place in the world. There's a reason why men are at 3 times higher risk of a death of despair from suicide or drug overdose or alcohol. There's a lot of men, especially in working class communities, who are just genuinely hurting in one way or another. So just from a straightforward human flourishing point of view, there's a bunch of men really suffering. And so if we could reduce their suffering, that would be a net good. But then second round effects would be for families, for children, for women, for communities. Right now, we're just leaving too much talent and energy on the floor because we're losing so many of our men. And that's, by the way, means that more women are having to pick up more of the work. They have to work what Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist, calls the double shift. They have to do the men's work of earning the money and the women's work of raising the kids. And that's not great for anybody, not least the women themselves. And then above all, also to get dads into our communities more. There's this amazing piece of social science from Raj Chetty, which finds that in this is largely in black neighborhoods, where there are lots of black dads around, black boys do better, even if their own dad is not around. So the mere presence of there being other engaged dads around a community is good for everybody, especially for the boys in that community.
Richard, I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoy this conversation.
Well, good luck with the piece, and I really admire the fact that you're taking these questions on. So, Godspeed to you as well. Thanks, Jim.